Hello, and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books out loud. This right here is a little blue book. It happens to be Little Blue Book number 1266, and it is entitled Great Fighters for Freedom, written by J.V. Nash, and it was copyrighted in 1928. This is part 3. We left off at the bottom of page 24. And let's pick up now. Towards Venice we progressed, and took Rotterdam on our way. That was clean out of our way. There we met with aged learning's chief ornament, that abundant and supergenius cleric, Erasmus, as also with merry Sir Thomas More, our countryman, who was come purposely over a little before us, to visit the said grave Father Erasmus. With talk, with conference, we had then, it were here superfluous to rehearse, but this I can assure you, Erasmus, in all his speeches, seemed no much to mislike the indiscretion of princes in preferring of parasites and fools, that he decreed with himself to swim with the stream, and write a book forthwith in commendation of folly. But that was kind of weird to read. The praise of folly was a devastating satire on human stupidity. It was like a sharp, cold wind sweeping through the hot and stifling atmosphere of church and state. While the bigots fumed over it, all Europe was convulsed in laughter. In it, the theologians and friars are castigated with whips dipped in vitriol. Here is a sample. Remember, it is not the raving of an atheistic enemy of the church. It is the comment of a Catholic clergyman on the character and conduct of the friars in his day. They call it a sign of holiness to be unable to read. They bray out the psalms in the churches like so many jackasses. They do not understand a word of them, but they fancy the sound is soothing to the ears of the saints. The mendicant friars howl for alms along the street. They pretend to resemble the apostles, and they are filthy, ignorant, impudent vagabonds. They have their rules, forsooth. Yes, rules. How many knots, for instance, there may be in a shoestring, how many petticoats should be cut of colored, how much cloth should be used in their hoods, and how many hours they may sleep. But for all else, for conduct and character, they quarrel with each other and curse each other. They pretend to poverty, but they steal into honest men's houses and pollute them. And, wasps as they are, no one dares refuse them admittance for fear of their stings. They hold the secrets of every family through the confessional, and when they are drunk or wish to amuse their company, they let them out to the world. If any wretched man dares to imitate them, they pay him off from the pulpits, and they never stop their barking till you fling them a piece of meat. Immortal gods, he continues, never were such stage players as these friars. They gesticulate, they vary their voices, they fill the air with their noise. To be a friar, mendicant, is a professional mystery, and brother instructs brother. They lift their theologic brows, they talk of their doctors solemn, doctors subtle and most subtle, doctors Sepharic, doctors doctors cherubic, doctors holy, doctors irrefragable. They have their soliloquiums, their majors and minors, interferences, corollaries, suppositions, and for a fifth act of the play they tell some absurd story and interpret it allegorically, tropologically, analogically, and make it into a chimera more extravagant than poet ever invented. They open their sermons quietly and begin in a tone as low as they can scarcely hear themselves. Then suddenly they raise their voices and shout, when there is nothing to shout about. They are directed to be entertaining, so they crack jokes as if they were asses playing the fiddle. They practice all the tricks of the platform, and use them badly, and yet they are admired, wonderfully admired, by women who are on bad terms with their husbands. And so on. In 1521, Erasmus published his famous collection of colloquies, little stories in conversational form in which popular superstition is held up to ridicule. Even when he published the book anonymously, no one was deceived, for Erasmus was as imitable as Voltaire or Anatole France, to whom he was the intellectual progenitor. Among his readers and admirers was Leo X, the cultured and worldly Medici Pope, who was made a cardinal at 13 and assumed the triple tiara at only 38. "It's our old friend again," he commented dryly, on laying down the praise of folly. There is much in the life and work of Erasmus that forecasts Voltaire. They were both all their lives semi-invalids, who yet possessed a tremendous capacity for hard work. They wrote or edited books in prolific quantity. They had correspondents everywhere, to whom they wrote thousands of personal letters which have been preserved, and still they had time for the social intercourse which they both loved. Erasmus wisely cultivated the friendship of the Pope as a protection against attacks by inquisitors and lesser bigots. He dedicated his critical Greek Testament to the pontiff, and the enemies of the higher criticisms could only bite their lips in impotent wrath. Voltaire adopted the same strategy. He dedicated his Mahomet to the Pope of his day. Erasmus never openly broke with the Church, neither did Voltaire. And as long as they professed allegiance and went through some of the forms of the Catholic religion, they could not be excommunicated without placing the Church in an embarrassing position as an avowed enemy of enlightenment. Erasmus, indeed, might have become a cardinal before his death, but he declined the honor. Like Voltaire, Erasmus finally took shelter under the shadows of the Alps. In 1521, he missed a page there. In 1521, he turned the page. He settled permanently in Basel, in the capacity of general editor and literary advisor for Froben's Press. His income was precarious until he went to Basel. He had frequent offers of generous patronage from kings and other official dignitaries, but the conditions attached to such offers irked him. He preferred to retain his independence as a freelance, tutoring, lecturing, writing, and gratefully accepting little windfalls now and then from friends and admirers. Again, like Voltaire in a later day, Erasmus was always ready to use his great influence in the cause of humanity and justice. Fondé relates the following instance. Heresy hunting had begun in the Low Countries. A Dominican monk had turned out some poor free-thinking wretch and denounced him in the church courts. The victim was saved from the stake by a defeat of evidence, but he was sentenced to imprisonment for life. His wife for 3 months and his daughter were forced into a convent. Erasmus heard of it. He knew the Dominican, knew him for a false, avarice, insolent priest. He sent Battus to remonstrate with the judges. He persuaded the abbot of St. Bertin to interfere. The sentence was reversed, and the unfortunate heretic has had his pardon. Young scholars and embryo writers penned letters to Erasmus, asking for advice, and the great man found time to reply to these humble correspondents. Here is a characteristic reply which he wrote from Orleans to a student in Lubbock. Read first the best books on the subject which you have in hand. Why learn what you will have to unlearn? Why overload your mind with too much food or with poisonous food? The important thing for you is not how much you know, but the quality of what you know. Divide your day and give to each part of it a special occupation. Listen to your lecturer. Commit what he tells you to memory. Write it down if you will, and recollect it, and make it your own. Never work at night. It dulls the brain and hurts the health. Remember, above all things, that nothing passes away so rapidly as youth. Erasmus, like Voltaire and Paine, was a deist. Just how deep his deism was, it is impossible to say. At times, however, we wonder. He remarks somewhere, I cannot locate the reference at the moment, that God was manifestly unfair to the female sex, because while it is recorded that he had one son, we are nowhere informed that he had ever had a daughter. As to the divine authority of the papacy, Erasmus apparently was not much impressed by its historical basis. In a letter written in Louvain, January 28, 1521, he says, "I know not how popes came by their authority. I suppose it was as the bishops came by theirs. Each presbytery chooses one of its members as president to prevent divisions. Bishops similarly found it expedient to have a chief bishop, to check rivalries and defend the church against the secular powers." Erasmus, just as much as Luther or any of the Protestant reformers, wanted the Bible to be available to everybody. He, however, did not make a fetish of the book. He was the first to edit a critical text of the New Testament in Greek, applying to the Word of God the same methods that would be used in editing the text of any other book. If he became convinced that a certain word or passage was an interpolation or a forgery, he did not hesitate to throw it out. For instance, he omitted as spurious one of the most important proof texts in the New Testament, a verse in the second epistle of John, verse 7, which had been held especially sacred because it was the only passage in the New Testament which seemed to confirm explicitly the doctrine of the Holy Trinity. His omission of this text raised such a storm of protest that he was forced to put it back, and it remains to this day in the authorized Protestant version, as well as in the Douay, the Catholic Bible. Modern revised versions of the New Testament, however, recognize that Erasmus was right, and they all drop the text without apology. Besides his edition of the Greek Testament, Erasmus edited critical texts of a long list of the Greek and Latin classics, as well as of the early church fathers. Among the former, he edited Ausonius's Cicero, several works, Quintus Curtius, Hysteria, Augustus, Horace, Lively, Ovid, Persius, Plaudius, Plini's Natural History, Seneca's Tragedies, Suetonius's Minds of Publius Sirius, Terence, Aesop, Aristotle, Demosthenes, Euripides, Galen, Isocrates, Josephus, Libanus, Lucian, Plutarch's minor works, Ptolemy, and Exonophon. It's a lot of really hard to pronounce names there. Erasmus was the first writer to achieve a genuine European reputation, comparable to that of Voltaire in a later age. From early childhood he thought in Latin, spoke it exclusively, and wrote all his books in it. He was read and admired wherever people could read, because Latin was the international language, and anyone who could read at all could read Latin. He was universal in his appeal. Pardon me. Luther, on the other hand, was interested only in his own theological ideas and tolerated little else. He preached within a restricted territory and was strongly antagonistic to sects in other localities, differing slightly from his own doctrine, and he wrote exclusively in German. The Triumph of the Lutherans, sighed Erasmus, is the death of good learning. In a reference to Germany, where Luther was now all-powerful, Erasmus laments that dogmatical disputations were taking the place of culture and free thinking. In a word, Erasmus saw in Lutheranism the breaking up of the people into warring sects and the death of real culture. Erasmus, like all persons of large and tolerant minds, abhorred warfare of all kinds. He frankly admitted that he had no desire to be a martyr on either side of the theological war which was soon raging. Others may be martyrs, he wrote. I aspired to no such honor. He was an uncompromising pacifist in a day when militarism was accepted as normal and even virtuous by the leaders in both church and state. How foolish, Erasmus remarks in substance, for men to murder each other wholesale over political boundaries and for the maintenance of empires which are doomed to disappear some day inevitably. Erasmus, by his nature a republican, some of his bitterest invective is directed against the evils of monarchy. Here is a passage that sounds for all the world like Paine in his Rights of Man. In all history, ancient and modern, scarcely in several centuries are found one or two princes whose signal folly did not inflict ruin on mankind. Do we not see that noble cities are erected by the people and destroyed by princes? That a state grows rich by the industry of its citizens and is plundered by the rapacity of its rulers? The good laws are enacted by representatives of the people and violated by kings. That the commoners love peace and the monarchs foment war. Erasmus was the first advocate of universal democratic education. He believed not only in education, but in free discussion. If we want truth, he declared, every man ought to be free to say what he thinks without fear. As did Voltaire, Paine, Jefferson, and other more recent freethinkers, Erasmus professed a high regard for the character and moral teachings of Jesus, but he was just as remorseless an enemy as they to superstition and childish supernaturalism. He insisted that reason is man's best guide, and that it must govern in religion as much as in other fields. Now, his appeal to reason was just as odious to Protestants as to Catholics. Erasmus had undoubtedly furnished Luther with the ammunition which he used against the abuses tolerated in the church. Erasmus laid the egg and Luther hatched it. Became a common saying even in the lifetime of both men. But when Erasmus perceived that Luther was interested merely in setting up a blind bigotry and becoming the father of a new superstition, he parted company with him. Both sides challenged Erasmus to champion its cause. Erasmus was valuable in his protestations of loyalty to the Catholic faith, whether sometimes with his tongue in his cheek we cannot say, but at any rate he doggedly refused repeated entreaties to enter the arena against Luther. "I am no theologian," he would say, and as for Luther, why, he had never met the man. And when the Lutherans urged him to support the Reformation, he just as persistently declined. He looked on with an ironical smile playing over his thin lips, while Protestant and Catholic rushed at each other's throats. Erasmus had hoped that by a slow process of evolution, reason would come into her rights, that dogma and theology would ultimately fade out of men's minds. But he thought that this consummation would only be frustrated by violently attacking the church and stirring up the sleeping dogs of theological controversy. A new superstition would be substituted for the old, and fanaticism given a fresh lease on life. Now, the idea that the mind should rule over the dogmas of religion astonished and greatly shocked Luther, who perceived, correctly enough, that too great an attention to the intellect made for a loss of faith. With his customary intemperance of language, he denounced the intellect as the bride of the devil. He would humiliate reason, even annihilate it, in order to destroy men's intellectual pride and make them more amenable to divine revelation. And I believe we'll stop there. That's the bottom of page 33. And that'll be the end of part 3. We'll see you in part 4. Thanks for listening.